Mrs. Eddy by Hugh Studdert Kennedy. Chapter 26. The Church. Once again, the dissensions which entered so largely into the chronicle of Mrs. Eddy's life in 1878, important as they are, tend to obscure far more important developments. In spite of all defections and disloyalties, unwise suits, and amazing criminal charges, the foundations of a great movement were being laid. It is only in the perspective of the years that this can be clearly traced. For in those early days, it seems to have been one of the characteristics of the Christian Science movement that it never presented the appearance of rapid growth. New adherents were constantly coming in, many of them actuated largely by curiosity. They stayed for a time, and then stayed away for a time, and then came back again. Others remained longer and went on, and never turned back, or went out and never returned. The movement was, however, steadily expanding. Even those who dropped out, whether they did so early or late, in friendship or in wrath, were still missionaries of the new teaching, at any rate to the extent that they told others about it. And very often, as the subsequent history was to prove conclusively enough, an adverse criticism was even more effective in making a new disciple than a favorable one. But the movement had no definite headquarters outside of the little front room at No. 8 Broad Street in Lynn. Several attempts had been made to secure such a focal point. On June 8, 1875, it will be remembered, 8 of Mrs. Eddy's students had banded themselves together informally, calling themselves the Christian Scientists, and pledging themselves to raise money enough to have Mrs. Eddy address them every Sunday. The meetings were continued for 5 successive Sundays, and then, as already noted, were abandoned, owing to the rising tide of argument brought to the meetings by spiritualists and others who dissented from Mary Patterson's teaching and resented her well-known disapproval of spiritualism. Thereafter, for about a year, there was no definite move towards an organization of any kind, and then, in the summer of 1876, came the Christian Scientist Association. This second attempt at organization differed importantly from the first in that it made no direct effort to enlist the interest of the general public. It was devotional rather than missionary in its purpose, and designed to establish and develop those already interested, rather than to make new converts. It held more or less regular weekly meetings, but always in the homes of different students, usually in Lynn, but sometimes also in Boston, Roxbury, and Salem. Mrs. Eddy seems to have approached the idea of organizing a church of her own with a considerable amount of hesitancy. Indeed, in the 9 years which intervened between what has come to be regarded as the date of her discovery of Christian Science in 1866 and her publication of the first edition of Science and Health in 1875, she was evidently convinced that church organization was a hindrance rather than a help to the highest spiritual development. "We have no need of creeds and church organizations," she wrote, "to sustain or explain a demonstrable platform that defines itself in healing the sick and casting out error." The mistake the disciples of Jesus made to found religious organizations and church rites, if indeed they did this, was one the Master did not make. Christ's church was truth. "I am truth and life." The temple for the worshippers of truth is spirit and not matter. No time was lost by our Master in organizations, rites, and ceremonies, or in proselyting for certain forms of belief. But Mrs. Eddy, in the attic room of No. 8 Broad Street in Lynn, writing Science and Health, with the weapons of her warfare still largely untried and the world still largely uncontacted, was one thing. And Mrs. Eddy, definitely confronted with the problem of spreading her gospel, was quite another. As she was to write some years afterwards in a later edition of her book, "Until the author of this book learned the vastness of Christian Science, the fixedness of mortal illusions, and the human hatred of truth, she cherished sanguine hopes that Christian Science would meet with immediate and universal acceptance." It cannot have been long before she was compelled to abandon this hope, and the conviction that the world of her day would find it difficult, if not impossible, to accept her teaching, save through the accustomed channel of a church, must have followed soon afterwards. This was especially true in the world of New England, to which she first addressed herself. As long as a man went to church, or at least was not opposed to church going, he might believe what he liked, and however regrettable, it would not be out of order. But if he did not go to church, or, worse still, was opposed to church going, he could not expect to be accepted as a religionist at all, much less get a hearing as an exponent of a new faith. A great many of Mrs. Eddy's most useful and effective students in these early days had been active in church work before they came into Christian Science. Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, all strongly evangelical in purpose and organization. They wanted a church to work for, and were all too evidently at a loss when confronted with the prospect of working out their own salvation and that of others in any but the accustomed way. Mrs. Eddy was quick to grasp the situation, and so, in the summer of 1879, steps were taken to form a chartered church organization. In August, she and some of her students met together, elected officers and directors, chose a name, the Church of Christ Scientist, and applied to the state for a charter. The officers and directors were Mary B. G. Eddy, President, Margaret J. Dunshee, Treasurer, Edward A. Orne, Miss Dorcas B. Rawson, Arthur T. Buswell, James Ackland, Margaret J. Foley, Mrs. Mary Ruddock, Orrin Carr, Directors. On August 23rd, the charter was granted. The purpose of the corporation was to carry on and transact the business necessary to the worship of God, and Boston was named as the place within which it would be established. The charter members numbered 26. These apparently orderly developments might reasonably suggest for their central figure a period of greater quiet and freedom from harassment than had hitherto been her lot. Such, however, was very far from being the case. The lawsuits of 1878, culminating in the conspiracy to murder trial, had drained Mrs. Eddy's financial resources to the limit. They had also left her burdened with a sense of fear over the machinations of her enemies, which at times cast her into the depths. If her opponents could seize her husband and throw him in prison, arraign him before the courts on the charge of murder, and carry them all through a maze of incoherencies like nothing so much as an evil dream, what could they not do? True, she put up a stiff fight against it all, but she had not only her own fears to combat, but those of her students. They crowded around her like frightened children, wondering which of them would be the next victim. Indeed, there emerges definitely about this time a situation or condition which was to become almost characteristic of the movement in the future. And a just appraisal of this condition would seem to be essential to a just appreciation of Mrs. Eddy's own history, especially in its relation to the movement she founded. Much more than most leaders, Mrs. Eddy seems to have been uniformly ahead of her followers. With one or two exceptions to be noted later, there never was anyone, especially in those early days, who could be said to have been able to keep pace with her, even to the extent of being readily within hail. By the time they had caught up to a certain point, she had gone on ahead. Too, it often happened with some of her followers that when they reached a certain point, they were so interested in it or concerned about it that they literally camped around it. And what they ultimately did with it largely depended on the view taken of it by those who got there first after Mrs. Eddy had gone on. These early comers preached to those who came after with all the authority of senior students. And in this way it was brought about that many went off entirely on some tangent or other. Or if they went on, they did so with clouded vision, hampered with burdens which their leader had long discarded. On the other hand, among those who came afterwards would always be large numbers who had read her book sufficiently aright to see where mistakes were being made by others and not be influenced by them. These pressed on, and often a very young disciple would be found suddenly in the van. In no circumstances was all this more true in this matter of the fear of malicious mental malpractice. To many students, it became an obsession. They accepted the idea of danger with both hands, and there they stayed. The sure defense which Mrs. Eddy had proclaimed, and to which she was ever seeing to have recourse, namely, an understanding of reality, meant to them little or nothing. The new idea of God was to them completely overshadowed by what was nothing more than a new idea of devil. The conspiracy to murder charge against Dr. Eddy and Ahrens left the whole movement under a cloud of fear, which culminated in an incident almost as bizarre as the charge itself and the trial which followed. So sorely depleted were Mrs. Eddy's resources as a result of legal proceedings that she and her husband decided to rent their house and move for a while to Boston. This they did in the early part of 1879, living very simply in a two-roomed apartment. Shortly before they made the move, Mrs. Eddy had heard again from that strange, shadowy character, her son, George Glover. He was now a man in the early 30s, and after being mustered out of the army at the close of the Civil War, had, like many others, disappeared into the unknown as far as his relatives were concerned. George Glover and his relations with his mother, and vice versa, seem at first to present something of an enigma, until his restless character and the nature of his upbringing are given their full weight. Having all his father's love of change, circumstances made him, from his earliest childhood, much more the son of Mahala Sanborn, the blacksmith's daughter and upper servant in the Baker household, than of his own mother. It was to her he learned to look in those first years, when his mother was able to have him with her seldom, and what was at first a necessity quickly became a preference. The kitchen and the blacksmith's shop constituted for him the real venue of his life. Then, when Mahala married Russell Cheney, and he went to live with them at North Groton, he became, to all intents and purposes, their son. However, the ruling passion of his life was freedom from restraint of any kind. When the Cheneys went west, he, as already noted, went with them. But he always seems to have been a round peg in a square hole, and it was to get away from Mahala and Russell Cheney that he enlisted in the army at the outbreak of the Civil War. Then the war was over. He drifted from one place to another, and from one employment to another, eventually becoming interested in mining as his major occupation. He wrote to his mother occasionally, but he had a way of disappearing for years at a time, leaving no address or means by which he could be reached. Towards the close of 1878, Mrs. Eddy had evidently heard from him again, for early in 1879 she wrote to him from Boston, telling him how much she wanted to see him. She and Dr. Eddy had some thought at that time of going to Cincinnati to settle, getting away from the growing turmoil of Lynn and Boston, and making a fresh start. The idea was given up almost as soon as it was conceived, but it was no doubt this plan that decided Mrs. Eddy to write to George Glover, for when she wrote to him, she suggested they should meet in Cincinnati. The invitation was evidently timed exactly right, for George seems to have gone at once to Cincinnati, and when he did not find his mother there, he came on to Boston. His arrival, as may be imagined, created quite a stir among Mrs. Eddy's students. She was sincerely fond of him, and no doubt had often spoken to her friends about him, and now they were to see him in the flesh. His short sojourn in Boston was a veritable March visitation. He came in like a lamb and went out like a lion. At first, the novelty of the situation appealed to him strongly. He was the center of attention among quite a number of people. And when Mrs. Eddy, perhaps too ready to believe the best of people, urged him to stay with her and study Christian Science, insisting that she was sure he would make a wonderful student, he cheerfully and hopefully assented. It was at the period that the fear of malpractice was at its height. Mrs. Eddy herself had by no means found her feet, and her followers could talk of nothing else. George was all agog. Here was something he could believe in, and it was not long before he was up in arms against all his mother's enemies, real or imaginary. Among these, Richard Kennedy was still quite evidently the ringleader. He determined to stop Richard Kennedy, and simple Westerner that he was, adopted what was to him the normal and natural way of effecting his purpose. He always carried a gun which bulged ominously beneath his coat, and he determined to get the drop on Richard Kennedy and then make him acquiesce in his demands. Some 30 years later, at the time when Joseph Pulitzer was using the great power of his paper to expose Mrs. Eddy and discredit her movement, George Glover told the whole story, or his version of it, to the New York World. It bears all the earmarks of having been astutely written up for the occasion, but it makes interesting reading. Within a week of my arrival in Boston, I learned strange things. The strangest of these was that rebellious students were employing black arts to harass and destroy my mother. The longer I remained with Mother, the clearer this became. Pursued by evil influences of the students, we moved from house to house, never at rest and always apprehensive. It was a maddening puzzle to me. We would move to a new house, and fellow lodgers would be all smiles and friendliness. Then, in an hour, an inevitable change would come. The friendliness would vanish under the spell of black magic, and we would be ordered to go. But Mother made it all very clear to me. It was Kennedy that Mother talked of most. He was a master hand at the black arts, as Mother pictured him to me, until at last I made up my mind to cut him short in his evil work. But I kept my plan to myself. One morning, I slipped my revolver into my overcoat pocket and left our boarding house. I had never seen this man, but I knew where he had offices, and I walked straight there. He was doing business as a healer, and his name, lettered on a brass plate, was on the door of his office. Every detail of that visit is as clear in my mind today as if it took place a week ago. The girl who admitted me asked me if I was a patient, and I answered yes. She then led me straight to Kennedy's office on the second floor of the house, opened the door, bowed me into the room, and hurried away. Kennedy was before me, seated at his desk. He looked up smilingly and asked, "Are you in need of treatment?" Pulling out my revolver, I walked up to him, pressed the cold muzzle against his head, and said, "I have made up my mind that you are in need of treatment." There, while he shook like a jellyfish in terror, I gave him his one chance to live. I told him that my mother knew of his black art tricks to ruin her, and that I had made up my mind to stop him or kill him. You needn't tell me that you aren't working your game of hypnotism to rob her friends and drive Mother into madness, said I. My word to you is this: if we have to move to another boarding house, I will search you out and shoot you like a dog. I shall never forget how that man pleaded for his life at the end of my weapon and swore that the black art accusation was false and my mother had deceived me. But it did the business all right. We were not ordered out of another boarding house that winter. Richard Kennedy, who was still living in Boston at the time the World published George Glover's statement, vigorously denied that he was ever thus intimidated. And in any event, inasmuch as the World at that time was trying to show that Mrs. Eddy was incompetent to manage her own affairs and had for years been insane, grave doubts attach to the whole story. It is interesting, however, as showing that the strongest impression which George Glover carried away with him was that produced by Mrs. Eddy's explanation of animal magnetism. Whatever he may or may not have been told, his thought ran readily into the old lines of superstition and emerged eventually in a belief in witchcraft and black magic. But whether it was all imagination or worse on the part of Glover, assisted by the World reporter, or there was more than a grain of truth in it, it is a fact that as the winter of 1879 gave way to spring and spring to summer, the fear of attack from their enemies, which had been so acute at the time of the conspiracy to murder trial, began to abate in the little circle at Lynn and in the other circles which were now forming themselves in other centers, notably in Boston and Salem. When the church was finally formed in August, everyone seems to have been in a much happier frame of mind. George Glover had gone home, Mrs. Eddy and Dr. Eddy were back again in Lynn, and the infant movement entered upon one of those brief periods wherein the smoke lifted and enabled Mrs. Eddy and her followers to see something of what they were winning. No attempt was made at first to bring the new church more prominently before the public. While Mrs. Eddy was in Boston, she and her followers had been in the habit of meeting on Sunday afternoons in a room hired for the purpose, in the Baptist Tabernacle on Shawmut Avenue. And although Mrs. Eddy's talks on these occasions were sometimes reported at considerable length in the Boston Globe, the meetings were still devotional rather than evangelical in character. The circle of her students, however, was quietly and steadily increasing. One of her most devoted followers about this time was a Mrs. Clara Elizabeth Choate, who had been healed some years previously while reading Science and Health. She and her husband, George D. Choate, lived at Salem with their little son, Warren. And so deeply were they attracted to the new teaching that in the summer of 1878 they moved to Lynn and took a house directly opposite Mrs. Eddy at the other side of Broad Street. In her reminiscences, written many years afterwards, Mrs. Choate gives an interesting picture of Mrs. Eddy about this time and the house in Broad Street as she remembered it. Notwithstanding all the turmoil of her life, there always seems to have been that about Mrs. Eddy and her surroundings which caused those who met her to forget all else, but that they were experiencing something entirely new. Mrs. Choate, in describing their first meeting in the front room at Broad Street, emphasizes just this point. When the double doors leading into the back parlor were at last opened, she writes, and I saw her standing there, I was seized with a sense of great gladness, which seemed to be imparted by her radiant expression. I cannot describe the exhilaration that rushed through my whole being. I was uplifted, and I felt a sense of buoyancy unspeakable. It was as though a consciousness of purity pervaded Mrs. Eddy, and from her imparted itself to me, whereupon I felt as if treading on air to the rhythmic flow of music. The house, as Mrs. Choate describes it, must have been typical of what was best in the simple New England home of the day, with its soft gray paper and lace curtains looped back over gilt arms, its crimson carpets and black walnut furniture, its flowers and its neatness. Mary, it will be remembered, from her early girlhood had a knack of making a home out of very little. As to Mary herself, perhaps the most grateful contribution Mrs. Choate makes to the picture of her at this time is the emphasis she lays upon her good cheer and the way she had of rallying her students when they were inclined to be discouraged or fearful, with some humorous remark which broke the spell for herself and everyone.